the Crusades were not just a clash of religions, and they were not just a grab for wealth either. They were a massive human project where belief collided with budgets, where sermons met supply chains, and where a moral cause had to pass through very unromantic filters like transport, provisioning, credit, and political bargaining. Welcome to Truth Behind History. By the end of this video, you will understand how a movement framed as holy war could only function through very real economic mechanisms, how money and institutions translated intention into action, and why the outcomes, including the surprises and the contradictions, make more sense when you look at incentives and constraints at the same time. We are going to treat the Crusades like a system, not a cartoon. A continent-wide mobilization that moved people and resources across long distances, under intense uncertainty, with limited administrative capacity, and with powerful authorities trying to coordinate it. And that raises a question worth sitting with right from the start. When leaders centralize a moral cause and ask millions to treat it as sacred, what happens to the incentives underneath? And what unintended consequences follow once faith is forced to operate through contracts, taxes, and logistics? Now, why did the year 1095 matter economically? Because by that point, Western Europe had developed a specific mix of pressures and capabilities that made a giant expedition imaginable, but also made it dangerously expensive and socially disruptive. Start with the social structure. Land and status were tightly bound together, and in many noble families, inheritance patterns meant not everyone could expect a stable share of power or property. That created a constant competition for honor, position, and patronage, especially among younger nobles and knights looking for a path that could elevate them. Now add a second ingredient: the economy was becoming more moneized in everyday life. More obligations, rents, and transactions were being handled in cash rather than purely in kind, which sounds boring until you realize what it enables. Cash makes it easier to hire, to buy supplies, to pay for equipment, and to move resources across long distances. In other words, cash makes a far-away campaign more feasible than it would have been in a strictly local barter world, but it also turns warfare into a problem you can price, and that means you can also finance it, and that opens the door to borrowing and leverage. Then there is a third ingredient that is easy to overlook. Violence inside Europe was a major governance problem. Local wars, raids, and feuds were not just moral issues, they were economic disruptions. They threatened trade, harvests, and the stability rulers and church leaders wanted. So efforts to manage violence, to channel it, and to attach rules and legitimacy to it, mattered a lot. If you can redirect aggression away from your own countryside and toward an external target, you might reduce local disorder, at least temporarily, while gaining a unified purpose. But here is the key tension on this slide: ambition was outpacing administrative capacity. Organizing tens of thousands of people for months or years, across unfamiliar terrain, requires coordination that most medieval institutions were not built to handle at that scale. That gap, between what people wanted to do and what their institutions could reliably coordinate, is where economic mechanisms start to appear. When you cannot rely on a modern bureaucracy, you lean harder on networks, pledges, bargains, and intermediaries. So by 1095, you have pressure from status competition, you have the growing usefulness of cash, and you have a political and moral environment trying to shape violence into something controlled. Put those together, and mass mobilization becomes possible, but the costs and risks are enormous, and that sets up everything that follows from this point onward. When people hear about the Crusades, they often picture a simple story, either pure devotion or pure greed, but this slide is about the offer that made mass participation possible, because it fused piety with policy in a way medieval society could actually act on. In the call associated with Pope Urban II at Clermont in 1095, the expedition is framed as a penitential act, meaning it is presented as a spiritual journey tied to repentance and moral purpose, with the promised reward described as remission of sins. Now, we should be honest about the evidence here. We do not have a single perfect transcript of what was said, and later chroniclers report versions that differ in wording and emphasis, so we should treat the speech tradition as a window into how the message was understood and repeated, not as a word-for-word recording. Still, across versions, the core structure is consistent. The movement is presented in the language of pilgrimage, but with an armed obligation attached, and that combination is powerful. Pilgrimage is familiar, it has social meaning, it signals devotion, and it already implies sacrifice, and when you attach military action to that framework, you change what participation feels like. It becomes not only permitted, but publicly meaningful, even admirable. And the message does not just aim at knights and lords. It also speaks to material pressures at home, and it contains a social expectation that the wealthy should aid those with fewer resources, which matters because long-distance campaigning was expensive and risky. In other words, this offer is not only spiritual, it is a coordination mechanism. It lowers reputational barriers, it creates moral legitimacy, it helps people interpret hardship as purpose, and it builds momentum by making the crusade vow feel like belonging to a collective project rather than a private gamble. You can almost hear the logic beneath the rhetoric. If enough people believe this is a sacred duty, then each individual becomes more willing to commit, and once that happens, the movement starts to generate its own pressure to continue. So the key point on this slide is simple but profound. A moral promise can act like a governance tool because it organizes human behavior at scale, and when it does not erase material constraints, it gives them a story that people will accept and act on. This slide is where the romance ends and the receipts begin, because crusading was not only dangerous, it was financially punishing, and the first economic reality to understand is that a long-distance expedition required a huge upfront commitment. For many participants, especially knights, the cost was so high that it could amount to multiple years of income, which means you cannot fund it with spare change or a few weeks of planning. You have to turn your household into a financing machine. And how do you do that in a medieval world? You liquidate, you pledge, you borrow, and you lean hard on networks. One common route was selling or mortgaging pieces of land or rights to income, essentially trading future security for present mobility. Another was borrowing through family connections, patrons, or institutions that could provide funds, sometimes with arrangements that reflected local norms and religious concerns about lending. And even when money could be raised, the cost was not only financial. Think about the opportunity cost in human terms. You remove trained fighters, labor, and leadership from a local community for an uncertain length of time. You strain harvest schedules. You expose estates to instability. You create succession risks. And that is before you even reach the destination. This is also where selection effects start to appear. Those who could mobilize resources, who had strong kin networks, who had assets that could be converted into cash, were more likely to go and more likely to survive the initial hurdles of travel and provisioning. Meanwhile, those who went without enough resources were exposed to higher risk and dependence on others. And that produces a hard truth that sits underneath the spiritual narrative. The crusade vow might be open to all in theory, but the ability to execute it was constrained by access to wealth, credit, and social support. Many who returned came back with changed reputations, but also with damaged finances, and some never recovered economically. So the main takeaway on this slide is not that people only went for money. That would be too simple and often wrong. The takeaway is that even sincere belief had to pass through a funding pipeline, and that pipeline reshaped who could participate, how they behaved, and what they were willing to do once they were committed. This slide is about the plumbing that kept the whole enterprise from collapsing under its own weight, because when you mobilize a moral movement at scale, you quickly run into a basic problem. How do you make strangers trust the system? How do you reduce friction? And how do you keep people compliant once they have promised something sacred but still live in a world of debts, lawsuits, and competing obligations? One answer was that the crusade vow evolved into a kind of legal bundle. Taking the cross was not just a spiritual statement, it could trigger protections and privileges that changed a person's legal and economic position at home, including safeguards for property and delays in certain legal actions. Those kinds of measures reduce the immediate costs of leaving and make participation more feasible, but they also introduce a real risk of distortion. If a vow changes your legal exposure or delays financial pressure, then the vow is not only a spiritual commitment, it becomes a strategic instrument. That does not mean everyone used it cynically, but it does mean the system creates space for moral hazard, where the rules designed to help sincere participants can also be exploited by those looking for shelter from obligations. Now, as the movement continued into the early 1300s, the papacy refined recruitment and administration, and you can see the leadership treating crusading less like a single event and more like an ongoing program that needed management, messaging, and enforcement. That is where institutions matter. The system needed intermediaries that could scale trust across distance, and military orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller became key nodes for that. They were not only fighters, they could function as administrators and reliable agents in a world where personal reputation and institutional continuity were everything. When you see them involved in things like organizing or assisting with financial measures connected to crusading, it reveals something important. Centralized goals require credible mechanisms to move resources, enforce rules, and coordinate action. Otherwise, the project stays stuck at the level of rhetoric. So the heart of this slide is that the Crusades were not sustained by passion alone. They were sustained by a growing architecture of contracts, privileges, and intermediaries that reduced uncertainty and made long-distance mobilization workable. And once those mechanisms exist, they do not only serve the original ideal, They become tools that can shape behavior, redistribute power, and change incentives in ways the original preachers may not have fully anticipated. If you want to understand how a crusade actually moves, you have to stop thinking only about armies and start thinking about ships, because sea power turned an inspiring idea into a practical operation, and it also turned transport into a marketplace. Moving people, horses, weapons, and supplies across the Mediterranean was not a casual matter. It was a high fixed cost industry, meaning you needed ships, crews, timing, provisions, and planning long before anyone landed on a distant shore. And when capacity is scarce and expensive, whoever controls the ports and fleets gains real bargaining power. That is why maritime cities could behave less like simple allies and more like contractors, negotiating terms in exchange for transport and naval support. Cities such as Genoa and Pisa, along with other seafaring powers in the region, competed for advantages that could outlast the campaign itself, things like trading privileges, special quarters in captured or allied ports, and favorable access to markets. In other words, the exchange was not only ships for piety, it was ships for position, and position could become profit later through commerce. This is where incentives become very clear. Crusade leaders needed mobility and supply lines, and maritime powers wanted long-term commercial leverage. When those interests align, cooperation looks natural. When they diverge, the contract structure and the bargaining process start to shape the Crusade's options on the ground. And there is an unintended consequence hiding in plain sight. Once transport becomes a negotiated service, the priorities of the campaign can become sensitive to payments, schedules, and enforcement of terms, not just to the original moral purpose. So the main point of this slide is that crusading was also a supply chain problem, and the people who could solve that problem with ships and contracts could influence outcomes, sometimes without ever swinging a sword. This slide is our case study in how a moral mission can be redirected by a balance sheet, because the Fourth Crusade shows what happens when lofty goals collide with a binding contract and a payment you cannot make. The basic structure is straightforward. The Crusaders needed transport and the infrastructure that only a major maritime power could provide, and Venice agreed to supply that transport for a massive payment of 85,000 marks. But then the real world intervened. Not enough Crusaders arrived as expected, or not enough money arrived on time, and the expedition found itself in a classic trap. You have already committed publicly, you have already assembled forces, and you have already bound yourself to a deal, but you cannot satisfy the terms. So what do you do when your creditor is also the one holding the ships, the schedule, and the supply chain? In that situation, options narrow quickly. The contract logic begins to shape the mission itself, because repayment has to come from somewhere, and that creates pressure to pursue targets that solve the debt problem even if they shift the original purpose. That is how diversion becomes thinkable. Attacking Zara and then ultimately turning toward Constantinople can be analyzed not as random betrayal or simple greed, but as the result of incentives stacking up under constraint, with leadership choices amplifying the path. And we should be careful here, because motives were mixed and debated. Some participants likely believed they were making the best of a broken plan, some sought advantage, and some were swept along by momentum. Still, the structure matters. Once the expedition is tied to repayment and to the division of potential gains, the campaign starts to behave like a venture with stakeholders and enforcement. Primary treaty language and narrative sources show the economic skeleton very clearly: shared fleets, repayment obligations, and a framework for distributing conquest gains. And leadership mattered too. Enrico Dandolo, the Venetian leader, operated within both political incentives and commercial constraints, and his choices shaped which alternatives were put on the table and which were framed as necessary. Now notice the deeper mechanism, because it is one we still see in many systems. Sunk costs. Once you have invested resources, reputations, and vows, turning back feels like failure, and that psychological and political pressure can make the next step, even a compromised step, feel more acceptable than stopping. So the central lesson of this slide is that debt and contracts can quietly become steering wheels, and a campaign that begins with sacred language can end up following the hard geometry of obligations, bargaining power, and locked-in commitments. This slide shifts us from marching and sieges to something even more revealing: what happens after conquest, when you have to govern, pay bills, and keep people alive. The Crusader states in the Levant were not just military outposts, they were political communities that had to function day to day, and one of the fastest ways to see their economic reality is to treat them as port and corridor economies under constant security stress. Coastal cities and ports mattered because ports generate revenue that is comparatively efficient to collect when you control the gates, the docks, and the flow of goods. Customs, tolls, and dues tied to trade could support fortifications and administration in a way that pure land revenue often could not, especially when the countryside was contested and unpredictable. At the same time, land and lordship still mattered because these societies tried to reproduce familiar patterns of rights, rents, and obligations, but those patterns were fragile when farms could be raided, roots could be cut, and alliances could shift quickly. That is why pragmatism shows up again and again in the historical record. Even when ideology framed neighbors as enemies, survival often required negotiation, truces, and practical trade arrangements when it served stability. And this is where the moral complexity becomes unavoidable. A system built on sacred warfare still needed courts, bureaucratic routines, dispute resolution, and predictable revenue streams, and that means governance choices had to be made that were not always clean, not always heroic, and sometimes openly contradictory to the loudest slogans. If you zoom in on the daily reality, the picture looks less like a single crusading banner and more like a web of tolls, permissions, fortified maintenance, provisioning, and local power brokers trying to keep the whole structure from collapsing. We should also admit a point of uncertainty. Historians debate the precise weight of different revenue sources in different places and periods, because conditions varied across regions and decades. But the broad institutional point holds. Conquest creates a governing problem, and governing demands revenue, and revenue collection pushes rulers toward mechanisms that are predictable, enforceable, and tied to choke points like ports and trade routes, even when the original justification for the conquest was framed in purely spiritual terms. This slide is about what happens when a distant war becomes a funding problem that local rulers cannot solve with old habits alone, because once you commit to repeated large-scale campaigns, you start needing revenue that is broader, more predictable, and easier to administer than the traditional patchwork of feudal obligations. Crusading pressures pushed governments and church authorities toward new ways of raising money, and one of the clearest examples is the Saladin tithe in England in the year 1188. What makes this case so important is not just that a tax existed, taxes were not new, but that the collection was organized in a structured way that mixed royal authority with ecclesiastical administration. You see a cooperative enforcement system where both religious and secular institutions are involved in assessing and collecting a levy on movable property and income streams, and you even see major institutional participants like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller connected to the process, which tells you something about trust and capacity in a world with limited bureaucracy. Here is the deeper point. When leaders centralize a moral goal, like funding an expedition framed as sacred duty, they often build tools that outlive the moment. A tax designed for an emergency can become a template, and a template can become a habit, and a habit can quietly reshape expectations about what authorities may claim from private property in the name of a higher purpose. That is a classic pattern in institutional history. The immediate justification is urgent, but the administrative capability created to meet the urgency tends to stick around because it is useful. And once you have a broader assessment method, local officials, enforcement rules, and institutional partnerships that can move money reliably, it becomes easier to reuse them for other priorities. So the takeaway on this slide is not simply that crusades were expensive, although they were. It is that the funding pressures helped accelerate techniques of fiscal administration, and in doing so, they nudged societies towards stronger state capacity and deeper entanglement between moral campaigns and resource extraction. This slide asks a question that historians and economists love to argue about because it forces you to stop thinking in one storyline and start thinking in distribution: who benefited, who paid, and what ripples did all of this create over time. If you picture a stakeholder matrix, the first group to consider is the obvious set of potential beneficiaries, which includes transport contractors and merchant networks that could profit from moving people and goods, securing privileges in ports, and expanding access to trade routes. Another group that could benefit, at least sometimes, were selected nobles and political actors who gained offices, patronage, or prestige by participating or by positioning themselves as key organizers. But then look at who likely carried major costs. Households that liquidated assets or took on debts faced real financial strain, and those costs did not vanish just because the campaign had spiritual meaning. Local communities also paid in less visible ways when labor and leadership were pulled away, when levies and collections increased, and when instability at home rose because key people were absent. And beyond Europe, the burden and disruption could be severe for populations caught in conflict zones, as well as for Eastern Christian communities who often found themselves squeezed between competing powers rather than protected by them. Now widen the lens to spillovers, because this is where the conversation gets tricky. Crusading activity interacted with long-run developments in Europe, including administrative techniques, financial arrangements, and Mediterranean connectivity, but historians debate magnitude and causality. In other words, it is fair to say there were connections, but it is also fair to say it is hard to prove exactly how much any single mechanism mattered compared to broader trends already underway. Still, the big analytical lesson is clear: when you mobilize people at scale, you do not just create battles, you create secondary markets, institutional adjustments, and political habits, and those can persist even after the original wave of enthusiasm fades. So as you look at this slide, keep asking the honest question: if a movement is presented as a shared sacred mission, but its costs and benefits land unevenly across different groups, what does that do to social trust, to legitimacy, and to the incentives of the institutions that learn how to manage the money and the manpower? This slide is where we stop collecting episodes and start asking what the evidence itself is really telling us, because if you step back, the Crusades reveal a repeating loop: belief generates institutions, institutions reshape incentives, and incentives push outcomes in directions that even sincere believers might not expect. One takeaway is that centralized moral mobilization can scale action quickly, because it creates a shared story that makes sacrifice feel meaningful, but speed and scale come with trade-offs. Once authority is centralized around a sacred goal, you start to see incentive distortions, because rules designed to enable devotion can also reward opportunism. You see principal-agent problems, because leaders and intermediaries can pursue their own interests while claiming they serve the larger mission, and ordinary participants often cannot fully monitor what is being done in their name. You see path dependence, because once vows are taken, contracts signed, debts incurred, and reputations invested, it becomes psychologically and politically harder to stop, even when the original purpose begins to blur. And you see how unintended consequences emerge without anyone needing to be a cartoon villain. None of this requires us to deny sincerity. Many participants likely believed they were doing something holy, and individual agency still mattered, because people made real choices under real constraints. The point is that sincerity does not cancel mechanics. In fact, sincerity can power a system so strongly that the system becomes harder to question, which raises one of the most uncomfortable questions on this slide. When a cause is treated as sacred, who audits the incentives underneath, and who has the moral standing to say, this is drifting, this is being exploited, or this is costing the wrong people too much? If you want a mature understanding of the Crusades, it lives right here, in holding two truths together. Moral conviction can inspire extraordinary action, and the institutional channels that turn conviction into coordinated force can also bend that action toward outcomes that reveal the limits of centralized control. For this final slide, I want to give you a clean path deeper, because the whole point of truth behind history is not to hand you a slogan, it is to hand you sources and a framework so you can test the story for yourself. If you want primary material that captures how the crusading message was remembered and transmitted, start with collections that present versions of the Claremont Call associated with Pope Urban II. Keep in mind, as we mentioned earlier, these are later accounts and they differ in wording, so read them as evidence of how the message was shaped and understood, not as a perfect transcript. If you want a concrete example of how crusading became a funding and administration project, look at the text of the Saladin Tithe from the year 1188, because it shows the structure of a broad levy and the way religious and secular authorities work together to enforce collection. If you want to see contract logic in action, explore the treaty and narrative sources connected to the Fourth Crusade, which make the economic skeleton of transport, repayment, and division of gains visible in black and white. Then, for scholarship that helps interpret these materials carefully, use modern studies that examine crusade costs and financing, research that looks at long-run political and institutional consequences, and studies that analyze papal strategy and administrative design under leaders like Pope Innocent III. For context on specific agreements, even a careful reference summary of the Treaty of Venice can help you place the Fourth Crusade contracting situation in a clearer sequence of events. This is the honest way to do history. You look at what people said, you look at what they built, you look at what incentives they created, and you follow the outcomes even when they complicate the story. If this video helped you see the Crusades as a system where faith, finance, and institutions collide, please like, comment, and subscribe, because it helps this channel reach more people who want history with depth. And here is my question for you: when a moral cause becomes a centralized project, do you think the biggest risk is corruption, or is it the unintended consequences that arise even when people mean well?